starts like any other morning, until it doesn't. A black woman walks into a courthouse, calm, composed, and entirely unaware that she's about to be violated by those entrusted with the law. They see her as a nobody. They mock her, disrespect her, and cross the line, all while smirking. But what they don't realize is they've just laid hands on the wrong person. Because she's not just another citizen. She's the one person who holds the legal power to ruin them. What follows is a storm of justice, exposure, and a courtroom twist that turns everything upside down. Stick around. You're not ready for what's coming. And hey, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments below. It was just past 8 a.m. when Celeste Monroe stepped out of her silver Buick and ascended the stone stairs of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. The morning sun was inching upward behind the old moss-draped trees, casting long shadows across the steps. She adjusted the lapel of her navy blue blazer, straightened her back, and held a slim leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels tapped softly against the pavement, each step a silent declaration. She never wore her judicial robe outside the courtroom. Never had. She preferred to enter public spaces as a citizen, quiet, observant, in control. But that morning, she wasn't received as a judge. She wasn't acknowledged as someone with authority. She was just another black woman walking into a place where power had always come at a price. At the main security checkpoint, the atmosphere changed the moment she approached. Deputy Hank Riker, a bailiff known for his hard-nosed attitude and outdated mindset, narrowed his eyes as she neared the metal detector. He didn't recognize her. More importantly, he didn't bother to try. He stepped forward, thick arms folded, and raised a gloved hand. "Ma'am," he said in a rough tone, "I'm going to need you to step aside." Celeste paused. "Is there a problem, officer?" Riker didn't respond right away. His gaze moved over her, from her silver-twisted locks to her tailored slacks, to the calm assurance in her expression. Something about her unsettled him. She looked like she belonged there, and in his world, people like her had to be reminded who held the real authority. "No ID visible. You can't just stroll into a federal building dressed like that," he muttered. Celeste calmly reached into her blazer and presented her federal credentials. The badge caught the overhead light, bright and unmistakable. But Riker barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket. She lifted an eyebrow. "I'd like that returned." He stepped closer. "You in a hurry, sweetheart?" The word landed like a slap. A second guard, a younger woman near the X-ray scanner, shifted awkwardly. She clearly sensed the tension but stayed silent. Just watched. "I need to get to a courtroom," Celeste said, voice firm. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Riker snapped, "including random checks. Let's move." He didn't wait for a response. With a firm hand on her arm, he guided her into a side hallway, away from the flow of people, into a small, windowless screening room just past the checkpoint. The air inside was cold and sterile. A single steel chair sat in the middle of the room. There was a rolling cart with scanning tools and a pair of clippers resting on its edge. Celeste's heartbeat thudded once. "I do not consent to this," she said clearly. "You have no legal grounds to detain me. This is unlawful." "That's reason enough," he replied, motioning toward the chair. "Sit down." She didn't move. He leaned in. "That badge you flashed? Doesn't mean a damn thing in here. Not to me." In moments, two more officers stepped in. One was a man in his 30s, shaved head, uneasy eyes, who seized her left wrist. The other braced the opposite side of the chair. Celeste's voice rose. "This is a violation. I want your names." No one answered. Instead, Riker picked up the clippers. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Standard procedure. You could be hiding something in that mop," he said, gesturing toward her locks. Celeste attempted to stand, but a harsh grip forced her back down. The clippers buzzed to life, the sound sharp and menacing. Before she could react, the cold teeth grazed her scalp. A thick lock of silver hair tumbled to the floor. Then another, and another. Her breath caught, but she didn't scream. She didn't weep. She didn't even flinch. She sat there as her dignity was stripped, strand by strand, watching the pieces of herself fall into a growing pile at her feet. One of the guards snorted. "She looks better already," he muttered. "Should have come in here with some respect," Riker said, brushing the hair from his sleeve. "Now you look more appropriate." Celeste's fists clenched in her lap, knuckles pale from the pressure. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "You'll regret this." He leaned down with a smirk. "People like you always say that." And just like that, it was over. Riker opened the door and gestured casually back into the hall. "Courtrooms that way," he said with mock politeness. Celeste rose slowly, her hands trembling just slightly. She retrieved her badge from Riker's desk without a word and stepped back into the corridor. Her stride was steady, her face unreadable, but in her chest, something deeper than fury had taken root, a sense of purpose. And in just a few moments, that purpose would change everything. Because what Riker didn't know was this: she wasn't there as an observer. She wasn't there as a defendant. She wasn't there for anyone else's judgment. She was the judge, and she was about to take her rightful place on the bench. The sound of the clippers echoed in her mind long after she left that cold room. Every step toward the courtroom felt heavier, not from fear, but from rage barely contained. Her scalp tingled where her hair had once proudly grown. Silver coils formed over years, rooted in family, history, and self, now gone. All that remained were rough patches and uneven tufts. The silence in the hallway pressed in like a weight. Celeste passed two clerks who glanced at her, then quickly looked away. They had heard, maybe they'd even seen, but neither had spoken. She didn't stop. She refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Her composure never cracked. Down the corridor, a soft murmur of voices drifted from the courtroom's double doors. It was a high-profile day, a hearing on police misconduct. Several officers were implicated in a violent altercation during a protest the year prior. National interest, major media presence. Celeste had been scheduled to enter through the private chambers. Her robe was laid out inside, staff prepared, protocol intact. But today, none of that mattered. She stopped just outside the courtroom, drew in a steady breath, and pushed both doors open with firm resolve. Silence fell instantly. Conversations ceased mid-word. Heads turned. Then the realization began to ripple through the crowd. Her heels echoed on the marble floor as she strode past rows of attorneys, reporters, plaintiffs, and defendants. Some stared, puzzled. Others looked stunned. At the front, behind the judge's bench, her seat sat vacant, waiting. And then it hit them. The woman they'd seen led through the halls like a suspect. The woman whose shaved head was evidence of abuse was not a helpless victim. She was the judge. Celeste stepped behind the bench and slowly turned to face the room. Her face was composed, icy even, not the calm of serenity, but the precision of control. A pen clattered to the floor near the defense table. The bailiff, the same man who had wielded the clippers, still stood near the side entrance. When her gaze met his, he froze completely. His mouth parted, but no words emerged. His face went pale. She didn't blink. Instead, she reached for the robe, folded carefully over the arm of her chair. She didn't ask for assistance. She didn't wait for ritual. She put it on herself. One deliberate motion after another. It settled on her like armor. She turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" she asked, her tone steady and neutral. The clerk's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste gave a single nod, then took her seat. The leather groaned quietly under her weight. She faced forward. Her eyes never touched the man who had violated her. Not yet. Not directly. "We will begin with preliminary testimony in case 2371F, she said clearly. United States versus Charleston Police Department. Charges include abuse of authority, excessive force, and civil rights violations. Are all parties present?" A scattered chorus of "Yes, Your Honor" followed. Attorneys fidgeted in their chairs, some wide-eyed, others visibly ashamed. And a few looked angry. Angry that a black woman had dared to return. Angry that what should have broken her hadn't. She ignored them all. "We will proceed." The first witness took the stand, an officer who had been on site during the protest. He had shoved an elderly veteran to the pavement during a peaceful demonstration, fracturing 2 ribs. Celeste listened intently, jotting notes, asking no questions. Not yet. From her periphery, she noticed Riker inching toward the back of the courtroom. His hands fidgeted at his belt, his stance restless. He looked like he wanted to vanish, and he had every reason to feel that way. Following the second witness, she called a recess. The courtroom emptied in a daze. Even the lawyers spoke in hushed tones, as if too afraid to raise their voices. Celeste remained seated. After several minutes, only her clerk, 2 officers, and Riker were left inside. Then, finally, she turned her eyes on him. "Deputy Riker," she said, her voice sharp as cut crystal. He stopped mid-step. "Step forward." He stammered, "Yes, Your Honor." She gestured to the open space in the center of the courtroom. Now he obeyed, moving like a man approaching the edge of a cliff. "State your full name for the record." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Hank Riker. How long have you served as bailiff in this courthouse?" 14 years. She tapped a pen slowly against her notepad. Once, twice. Then she leaned forward. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in that screening room?" The color drained from his face. Your Honor, I didn't know. That's not what I asked." He looked around the room, searching for help. None came. "How many complaints have been filed against you, Deputy Riker?" I'm not sure." 12. Her voice was calm, but each syllable landed like a gavel. 12 formal complaints, all ignored, all buried, hidden behind procedures and so-called protocols. His mouth quivered. "I didn't know who you were. I thought, and that's the core of it, isn't it?" She snapped, her voice cutting through the air. "You thought I was a nobody, just another black woman you could intimidate, humiliate, shave for your amusement." The room was still, breathless. "You didn't even ask my name." Riker opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. Celeste stood. "Because of you, this courthouse, this so-called sanctuary of justice, has been tarnished. Because of your conduct, its integrity is now in question. And because you assaulted a federal judge within her own courthouse, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation." She turned to the officers flanking the door. "Escort Deputy Riker into custody. Separate him from general population. Formal charges to follow." The officers moved quickly. The cuffs were already in their hands. "No, wait, Riker shouted. "You can't do this." But he was wrong. She already had. The courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. Not after that. Deputy Hank Riker, once a symbol of unchecked authority, was now gone. Led out in silence, shackled by 2 silent guards. His badge had been surrendered, his authority stripped away, but the aftermath still lingered. It lived in the silence, in the way the ceiling fans seemed to hum just a bit too loudly. In the sideways glances exchanged between staff who had known for years but remained silent. Celeste Monroe leaned back in her chair, fingers interlocked atop the bench, her robe now resting on her like forged steel. There was no returning to how things had been before. And honestly, she had no desire to, because something had shifted, not only within her, but in the entire courtroom. Her clerk stepped in quietly, carrying a fresh stack of documents. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "the next witnesses are being prepared." Celeste nodded. "How long do we have?" "About 8 minutes." Celeste's gaze drifted past her, out toward the now empty gallery. Rows of wooden benches where jurors, journalists, and members of the public would soon return. But Riker's presence still clung to the space, like a grease smear on polished marble. She let out a slow breath. The day had already upended every expectation, and it was only mid-morning. The door creaked open behind her. Celeste turned. A young woman entered, early 20s maybe, her glasses fogged from rushing through the lobby. One of the interns. Megan, that was her name. Smart, quiet, rarely spoke unless addressed directly. She looked pale. Celeste offered a subtle nod. "Everything okay?" Megan hesitated. Then she shut the door behind her and stepped forward. I wanted to say I saw it," she whispered. "What happened with Deputy Riker this morning, outside the screening room. I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. I was scared." Celeste didn't respond immediately. She simply observed the young woman's trembling hands. Then she spoke gently. "Thank you for telling me. That matters. I didn't stop it."
"No," Celeste replied.
"But you're speaking now. That's more than most." Megan looked like she might cry, but she straightened her posture and added, "If you need me to testify, I will." Celeste reached across the desk, placing a hand over the girl's for just a moment. No words, just shared warmth. Then the courtroom doors groaned open again, this time with more weight. The public was returning. Celeste rose. "All rise," the clerk called, her voice steadier than before. Everyone stood, even those who didn't want to, even those who had once laughed at Riker's crude jokes behind closed doors. Celeste resumed her seat. Court is back in session. As the next witness took the stand, the atmosphere had shifted, quietly but unmistakably. Power was no longer ambiguous. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. The witness was a black father named Howard Briggs, mid-40s, a warehouse foreman, salt and pepper beard, hands rough from years of manual labor. His eyes were hollow but resolved. He had come to testify about how his 17-year-old son had been tackled and pinned during a peaceful protest by the same officers now sitting at the defense table. One of them had pressed a knee into the boy's throat. The teenager had survived, barely, but still couldn't speak above a whisper. That had been 9 months ago. Howard sat on the witness stand and recounted everything. How they'd pleaded for paramedics. How they were told he's fine. He's faking. How no one listened. And how, even after the footage surfaced, none of the officers had been held accountable. Celeste didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every word the man uttered was a blade slicing through the courtroom, leaving no one untouched. When he finished, Celeste leaned forward. "Mr. Briggs, thank you for your bravery. I know this isn't easy." He nodded, voice breaking. "I just want to know it mattered. That someone's finally listening." Celeste looked at him, not from a judge's bench, but as someone who knew precisely what it felt like to be silenced. "You've been heard," she said. A few minutes later, after he stepped down and walked past the officers who had nearly taken his son's life, Celeste called for a short recess. Her chambers were quiet, almost too quiet. She sat for a moment, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the wash basin, her uneven hair, the raw patch above her left ear. The woman in the mirror didn't look like a judge. She looked like someone who'd just come back from war. But maybe that was what justice truly looked like. Not a polished performance, but a battle for truth. One she had no intention of losing. There was a knock. Her clerk opened the door partway. "Your Honor," she said, "the U.S. Attorney's Office just submitted a sealed motion. They're seeking to escalate charges against Riker immediately. Civil rights violations under federal law." Celeste didn't flinch. "Good. Accept it." As the door closed behind her, Celeste finally let herself breathe. Not out of relief, but determination. The day wasn't over. Not even close. The courtroom had witnessed Riker's fall. But they hadn't yet seen what came next. The real reckoning was still ahead. The courtroom was full again. But it wasn't the same space anymore. Something unspoken had shifted. It hovered in the air like the charge before a storm. The kind of weight that made people sit straighter in their chairs, speak softer, and think twice before assuming they understood where the power lay. Celeste Monroe returned to the bench with an undeniable presence. No bailiff announced her this time. No ceremonial display. Just the sound of her heels against the hardwood floor and the soft rustling of her robe as she sat. Everyone stood instinctively. She didn't speak right away. She simply surveyed the room, the defendants, the media, the attorneys, and the silent spectators who had returned. Some still wide-eyed from what they'd witnessed earlier. They waited to see what she'd do next. how far she'd take it, whether this was just a moment or the start of a movement. She tapped the gavel once. "Court is now in session," she said, and just like that, everything came into place. She turned her attention to the prosecution table. "Call your next witness." The room fell silent once more as an officer, Lieutenant Daniel Cook, was sworn in. He was tall, built like a linebacker, clean-shaven, with that rigid posture that suggested he believed the badge made him untouchable. He took a seat, cleared his throat, and folded his hands in his lap. Celeste observed him for a long moment. She recognized the type. Confident, composed, trained to deceive with a smile and never flinch. The prosecutor started her questioning, measured and direct. "Lieutenant Cook, you were present at the demonstration on May 14th of last year, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And at that time, you were in charge of a team of 7 officers?" "Yes, that's accurate." "Did you personally approve the use of force against the demonstrators?" Cook leaned in slightly, speaking into the microphone as if addressing a press conference. "I authorized non-lethal crowd control tactics after the protesters became hostile. There was shouting, pushing. Some had bottles and rocks." "Any injuries on your team?" "No, ma'am." "And the injuries to protesters?" "Minor, mostly bruises." Celeste's voice cut in before the prosecutor could continue. "Lieutenant Cook." He turned toward her. "Yes, Your Honor? Would you consider a crushed windpipe a minor injury?" The question lingered. Well, no, ma'am. Of course not." Celeste leaned forward slightly. "Then why did your official report label it as a soft tissue injury consistent with resistance?" Cook hesitated. "That's standard wording. It was based on preliminary observations." "Preliminary observations from whom?" He shifted in his seat. "I believe Officer Valdez filled out that part." Celeste held his gaze. "And did you review and approve that language?" A pause. "Yes, Your Honor." "Knowing the victim was 17 years old and unarmed?" Cook opened his mouth, closed it, then finally replied, "Yes." Her tone remained even. "Do you believe justice was served that day?" Silence. I believe we followed procedure." She leaned back in her chair. "That wasn't the question." Cook cleared his throat again. "With respect, Your Honor, I can't answer that. That's not within my authority." Celeste nodded slowly. "No, it's mine." She turned back to the prosecutor. "You may continue." The remainder of the testimony was sterile, methodical, but each word landed with weight. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they framed it, as if it were routine, acceptable, ordinary. When the court recessed again, the gallery buzzed with murmurs. Reporters typing rapidly, advocates scribbling notes. A woman near the back clutched her chest, silently mouthing, "Thank you," as Celeste walked by. In her chambers, Celeste removed her robe and hung it neatly. Then she stared at it longer than usual, the way it appeared so plain, so unthreatening. Yet outside that room, that robe carried immense weight. Changed everything. Wearing it, people stood. They listened. They feared her authority. But just 2 hours ago, same face, same spirit, same dignity. Without that robe, she was assaulted and degraded like she didn't matter. That contradiction now lived inside her. It burned behind her eyes and echoed in her chest. A knock came. "Your Honor," her clerk said again. "Someone from the DOJ is here. They say it's urgent." Celeste straightened. "Send them in." A man in a gray suit entered. Calm, composed. He handed her a sealed envelope. "Judge Monroe, I'm from the Office of Civil Rights. I was dispatched the moment reports came in about this morning's incident." "Quick response," Celeste said, unfolding the letter. "This courthouse is under immediate federal review. What occurred in that screening room goes beyond misconduct. It's a Title 18 violation. And now that it's confirmed the victim was a federal judge." He trailed off. Celeste remained quiet. She didn't need to say a word. The man continued, "We're launching an immediate investigation into Charleston District Courthouse personnel. Prior complaints, document suppression, potential obstruction." "Good," she replied softly. Start with the supervisors who buried those 12 complaints against Riker. Then look at the judges who signed off. He nodded like he already expected her to say that. Oh, and Judge Monroe, he added, pausing at the door. You should know, the footage from this morning has gone viral. It's everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, social media. Even a few senators are talking. Celeste shook her head faintly. I didn't do it for them. He smiled. That's exactly why it matters. When he left, she sank slowly into her chair. Out in the courtroom, the next set of defense attorneys was arriving. She could already hear their footsteps, the rustle of papers, the hushed last-minute conversations. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready, because today wasn't just about taking down one racist bailiff. It was about unmasking an entire system, and it was far from finished unraveling. The courtroom was filled to the brim now. Word had spread, first about the arrest, then the video, then the woman behind it all. The federal judge who had walked into a courthouse and been treated like she didn't belong, only to reclaim her rightful place on the bench minutes later. Shamed, stripped, but unbroken. Everyone wanted to see what would come next. Camera crews gathered outside. Reporters lined the back rows. Civil rights lawyers flew in from Atlanta, D.C., even Chicago. You could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was history and justice colliding in real time. Judge Celeste Monroe stood just behind the bench as her clerk leaned in. They're here, the defense attorneys. They're requesting special counsel. Celeste raised an eyebrow. On what basis? They're arguing the case is compromised, that the judge is personally biased. A slow breath escaped her lips. Of course they'd try to spin it. They couldn't refute the facts, so instead, they targeted the one revealing them. Celeste gave a single nod. Let them ask, she said. I'll deliver my answer on the record. She stepped into a courtroom buzzing with tension. All rise. The entire room stood. Without glancing to either side, she walked forward, took her place at the bench, and tapped her gavel once. Please be seated. The energy shifted like a breath finally being exhaled. A defense attorney in a tailored pinstripe suit stood up, self-assured. Mid to late 40s, the kind of voice honed for both courtrooms and television segments. Your Honor, before we move forward, we'd like to make a formal motion. In light of recent developments, Celeste interrupted. You're referring to the arrest of Deputy Riker and the incident in the hallway this morning? He hesitated. Yes, Your Honor. And your concern would be? He cleared his throat. That these circumstances may raise concerns about a potential conflict of interest. Questions regarding judicial neutrality. The gallery stirred, a low murmur spreading. Celeste didn't flinch. You're implying that because I was assaulted this morning, I'm no longer capable of fulfilling my duties? I'm suggesting, he said cautiously, that there could be a perception of partiality. Celeste raised her hand, cutting him off. Let me stop you right there. She rose and walked slowly to the edge of the bench. I was publicly attacked, degraded, not for anything I said, not for anything I did, but because of who I am. Because someone saw a black woman entering a courtroom and assumed she couldn't possibly hold authority. She paused. Let the words settle. And what did I do in return? I took my seat. I conducted these proceedings. I followed every statute, every protocol. I've remained calm, composed, respectful, even when others have not. The attorney's jaw tensed. Celeste went on, her tone firmer now. You want to talk about bias, counselor? Real bias is a man using electric clippers to strip a woman's hair without cause, without permission, without even asking for her name. Real bias is a dozen ignored complaints from people who looked like me, buried by this institution. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp and steady. You want to bring up conflict of interest? Let's talk about how many judges approved Deputy Riker's actions over the years. How many prosecutors looked the other way. How your own firm has defended officers with misconduct records longer than their CVs. He looked as though he wanted to object, but didn't, because she was right. Celeste straightened. This court will continue as scheduled. I will not step aside. And if you truly believe this case can't withstand my oversight, you're welcome to file an appeal. I'll even provide the forms." She tapped the gavel again. Next witness. The prosecution brought forward someone unexpected. Not a victim, not a protester. A former courthouse employee, a middle-aged black woman, in a crisp suit, close-cropped hair, glasses. Her name was Denise Talley. Celeste recognized her at once. Not just from HR records. Denise had worked in the records department for years. Quiet, competent, never a single complaint. And now she was stepping into the spotlight. Denise was sworn in, took her seat, adjusted her blazer. The prosecutor approached. "Ms. Talley, can you describe your previous position here at the courthouse?" "I was the records supervisor for 8 years. Before that, I worked at the front desk." "And during your tenure, were you ever made aware of any complaints about Deputy Riker?" Her expression hardened. "Yes, more than I could count." "Can you give us an estimate?" 12 official reports, at least twice as many informal ones. "And what became of those reports?" Denise glanced toward Celeste, then spoke slowly. "They were mishandled. Some were marked resolved when they weren't. Some vanished completely." The room reacted, soft gasps, whispered disbelief. "Who gave those instructions?" A beat passed. Then, Judge Taryn Mahoney. That name hit like thunder. Mahoney retired 6 months ago. A spotless reputation. Widely respected. Celeste's former mentor once. But the truth couldn't be ignored. "Why would he suppress those complaints?" the prosecutor asked. Denise's voice trembled slightly, but she answered. "He said if we reported them, it would harm public confidence. That it would make the courthouse appear unstable." Celeste didn't move, because that specific excuse, that precise justification, was one she had heard before. Justice postponed to protect appearances. Abuse overlooked in the name of order. She scanned the room, locking eyes with individuals who had once dismissed or ignored what was now undeniable. Some were only now beginning to realize the system they had served wasn't protecting justice, it was preserving silence. Denise continued, her voice growing firmer. "I watched men like Riker roam these halls without consequences. I watched young black interns get stopped and questioned. I saw witnesses intimidated and dismissed. And every time I brought it up, I was told, 'That's just the way it is.'" Her voice cracked slightly. "Well, not anymore." Celeste swallowed hard. It was the kind of testimony that didn't just bolster a case. It shattered a facade. She called a recess. The courtroom rose. As Celeste stepped down from the bench, a young reporter near the gallery whispered to a colleague, "She's not just presiding over this court. She's rewriting it." And he was right, because this wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning, one that would send shockwaves far beyond that room. And it was nowhere near finished. By early afternoon, the courthouse steps were no longer quiet. What began as a handful of reporters with cameras had transformed into a large gathering of protesters, community organizers, and citizens. Black, white, elderly, young. Some holding signs, others simply standing, watching. It wasn't chaos. It was heavier than that. It was concentrated, intentional, waiting. And inside, Celeste Monroe sat at her desk, gazing out the window of her chambers at the swelling sea of people. She could make out the messages on the signs from where she sat. "Justice starts now. Protect black women. 12 complaints. 0 accountability." She shut her eyes briefly. Not to shut it out, but to take it in completely. The noise, the pressure, the truth bubbling up after years of being buried beneath red tape and silence. Another knock came at her door. This time it was her clerk. But behind her stood a man Celeste hadn't seen in nearly a decade, Reverend Marcus Hill. He stepped forward with the calm resilience of someone who had witnessed too much and still chose to keep fighting. His gray beard had filled in completely since she'd last seen him. His eyes were weary but warm. "Judge Monroe," he greeted. "Reverend," she replied, standing to meet him. "I won't keep you long," he said. "Just wanted you to know we're out there. We see what you're doing." And we stand with you." She gave a nod, swallowing down the sudden lump in her throat. He handed her a folded sheet of paper. Some of the folks out there, they were victims too. Of Riker, of others like him. They were never called to testify, never had their stories heard. But they're ready now. If you want their voices, they're willing to speak. She unfolded the page. Names, phone numbers, handwritten notes. It was longer than she expected. "How many of these are new complaints?" she asked. "Most of them," he said. "Some date back years. Some were too afraid. Some were told it wasn't worth the effort." Celeste looked up. "They were wrong. It is worth it now." Marcus offered a faint smile. "It is because of you." She didn't respond, but her silence was louder than anything she could have said. Once he left, she stared back down at the list. These weren't just names. They were the people this very courthouse had turned away. People who had been dismissed, mocked, forgotten. But not anymore. Back in the courtroom, the audience had nearly doubled. News of Denise Talley's testimony had spread like wildfire. Reporters were live-streaming. People outside were watching the proceedings through their phones. Some gathered by the courthouse windows under the October sun. The energy had shifted. When Celeste re-entered, the courtroom rose again. But this time it felt different. Not just because of tradition, not just for her title, but for what she symbolized now. She tapped the gavel once. "We're ready to proceed." The next witness was unexpected. The U.S. Marshal Service had sent someone not to investigate, but to testify. His name was Andrew Taylor, black, late 50s with over 2 decades of service. He walked with a slight limp, the result of an injury from a botched arrest back in 2001. He had once been stationed at this very courthouse, and now he stood before the bench again, this time with a truth he could no longer keep to himself. He took the oath, sat down, adjusted the microphone. "I worked here from 2004 to 2012, he began. "I saw a lot, and I let a lot of it slide. I didn't want problems, didn't want to be labeled the angry black officer." He looked directly at Celeste. "But what I witnessed from Riker, I should have reported. I didn't, and I regret that." Celeste gave a slow nod, allowing him the space to continue uninterrupted. Taylor went on. He started small. Little things, disrespect, excessive scrutiny on young men, making inappropriate comments. But it escalated. By 2010, he wasn't just aggressive. He was dangerous. "Did you ever file a report?" the prosecutor asked. "I submitted a memo to Internal Affairs," he said. "It disappeared. When I followed up, I was told, and I quote, 'He's the kind of guy we need dealing with the difficult ones.'" The courtroom reacted with a wave of horrified murmurs. Celeste's gavel restored order. Taylor leaned forward. "I left this courthouse 2 years later, not because of the job, but because of what it was doing to me. The silence, the guilt. But now I'm here to tell the truth. Because Judge Monroe, what you did sitting in that chair after what they did to you, that's bigger than just holding a gavel." The room was completely still, and for the first time all day, Celeste didn't speak. Not because she had nothing to say, but because sometimes, when history arrives at your feet, you don't speak over it. You let it resonate. The following morning, the air outside the courthouse felt heavier than usual. Charleston's early autumn sky was gray and low, pressing down like a warning. But inside Judge Celeste Monroe's chambers, the silence was colder. She sat at her desk, staring at a thick manila envelope labeled confidential, internal records. It had been quietly dropped off by a court administrator who hadn't said a single word. He simply nodded, placed it on her desk, and left, like the contents had scorched his hands. Celeste opened it slowly. Inside were documents, memos, emails, staff signatures, 12 formal complaints filed against Deputy Hank Riker over the past 15 years. All dismissed, all approved by a name she knew far too well, Judge Terrence Mahoney, her former mentor, the man who once championed her into the federal circuit, the man who once told her, "You are exactly what this bench needs." But now she saw his signature at the bottom of every rejection. each form stamped with the same cold phrases. Allegation unsubstantiated. Lack of corroborating evidence. No further steps required. Yet, tucked at the very back of the folder, one particular memo stood out. It was a confidential exchange between Judge Mahoney and the head of courthouse security, dated 5 years ago. Celeste read it once, then again. It stated, "Riker may be a bit rough, but he maintains control, especially with certain crowds. Best not to stir the pot." Her fingers clenched the page until it wrinkled. There it was, the quiet part spoken aloud. And it wasn't just about Riker anymore. It was the entire structure that had shielded him, endorsed him, emboldened him to grow harsher, louder, crueler, as long as it preserved their version of order. Celeste leaned back in her chair, eyes on the ceiling. This was no longer just a case, it was a cleansing. She looked down at her reflection in the polished surface of her desk. Disheveled hair, weary eyes, and still, the flame behind them burned. A knock. Her clerk again. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "we've received a formal inquiry from the Senate Judiciary Committee. They're requesting your statement regarding judicial oversight failures related to the Riker matter." Celeste let out a mirthless smile. Of course they are. Now that the cameras are rolling. The clerk hesitated. "There's more. 2 retired judges and 1 former DA submitted their resignations this morning, citing health concerns." Celeste said nothing. She simply stood up. "Call in the attorneys. All of them. We're concluding this today." An hour later, the courtroom was packed to capacity again. This time, not just local onlookers. Journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the BBC had crowded into the gallery. A line of young black law students filled the front pew, shoulder to shoulder, notebooks ready, eyes wide. This was no longer just Charleston's story, it had gone national. Celeste took her seat and tapped the gavel. "This court is now in session." She glanced around the room. "Before we proceed to closing arguments, I would like to submit new material into the record." She nodded to her clerk, who handed copies of the folder to both counsel tables. "This includes every prior complaint filed against Deputy Riker, all related correspondence concerning their dismissal, and the identities of every individual who approved those dismissals." The defense attorney attempted to object. Celeste raised her hand. "Sit down." Her tone was soft but final. She turned toward the gallery. "Let the record reflect that this court is no longer in the business of safeguarding institutions at the expense of individuals. We will no longer pretend that silence equals neutrality." Her gaze swept across the room. Every signature in this file reflects a decision, not an error. A deliberate decision to ignore victims, protect abusers, and preserve a facade of order founded on fear. She locked eyes with the defense attorney. "And it ends today." The room fell into such stillness that even the sound of a pen halting mid-scratch was audible. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a voice broke through. "Your Honor," called a man in his 60s, standing tentatively at the doorway. "May I speak?" A pause. Celeste gave a subtle nod. He stepped forward, hat in hand. "My name is Louis Bryant," he said, his voice trembling. "In 2011, I was arrested in this courthouse by Riker, just for raising my voice when my daughter's case was dismissed. He slammed me into a wall. I ended up with 2 broken ribs." Celeste asked, "Was a complaint filed?" "I filed it myself, right over there at the front desk. They told me I must have tripped. That's what the report said. I never came back." He looked around the courtroom. "But I'm here now." Celeste stood. "Anyone else?" A beat of silence. Then hands began to rise. 5, 10, 15. Every hand belonged to someone with a story. Each one had carried silence for far too long. And now, finally, they were finding their voice. Celeste didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't even move. She just watched as truth surged all around her. Not whispered, not hidden, not shielded by robes or badges, but spoken plainly at last. The final day of the hearing began with a storm. Not a light rain, not a gentle rinse. A torrent, one that swept over Charleston with both warning and reckoning. Streets flooded. power lines bent in the wind. And still they came. Reporters, protesters, court staff, interns, witnesses. They arrived with umbrellas, ponchos, cameras, and signs. Because by now, everyone understood. What was happening inside that courtroom wasn't just justice. It was history. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, but alive. The air practically pulsed, the way it does right before something irreversible. Celeste Monroe entered the courtroom silently. No gavel this time, no opening words. She stopped in front of the bench, faced the packed room, and removed her robe. Carefully, she folded it, laid it across the chair. She stood there, not protected by title or tradition, but simply a woman, wounded yet resolute. And she spoke. "I've sat behind this bench for years. I've worn the robe, held the title, issued the rulings, followed the rules. But I've also remained silent far longer than I should have. And today, I'm done with silence." Her eyes moved from the defense table to the prosecution, then out across the courtroom, at the citizens who had once been ignored, dismissed, erased. "This court finds Deputy Hank Riker guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct." She took a step forward. "And this court also recommends a full review of every complaint ever filed under his name, and a formal investigation into every official who helped bury them." She turned toward the court reporter. "Put that on the record." No applause followed, just silence, the kind that comes after something explodes, and everything changes. Then, slowly, she reached for a folder tucked beneath the desk, one that hadn't been opened until now. She held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said, "is a policy proposal, effective immediately." She continued without hesitation. "I am implementing a mandate for all bailiffs, marshals, and courthouse staff within this jurisdiction." Her tone remained steady. "It's called the Monroe Mandate." A few heads lifted at the mention of the name. "It requires thorough anti-bias training, psychological evaluations, routine performance reviews, and a strict zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory conduct inside federal courthouses." She held the folder high. "And I will take this to the circuit courts, the judiciary, and even the Senate if needed. Because what happened to me should never have happened to anyone. And I'll make damn sure it never happens again." There was a stirring in the gallery now. Subtle nods, quiet tears, hands clutched together in stunned unity. She went on. "Let me be clear. This has never been about revenge. This is about accountability, about owning the responsibility, about staring a broken system in the face and saying, 'Not anymore.'" She turned toward the defense and to those who had enabled this man to act without repercussions for over 10 years. "Consider yourselves officially on notice." She tapped the folder once more. "I will be submitting formal recommendations for disbarment, thorough reviews, and potential charges to the Department of Justice for every official who helped bury the truth." No one in the courtroom moved. They couldn't. Celeste then glanced past the rows of benches, toward the tall, arched window at the back of the room. The storm outside still raged, but light had started to pierce through, a ray of sunshine streaking across the marble floor. She gave a small nod, as though accepting the moment's timing. "Before we close, there's one last order of business." She looked to the side entrance. Officers opened the door and Hank Riker walked in, still in handcuffs, no longer wearing a uniform. His face looked pale, hollow, broken in ways that had nothing to do with bruises or injury. He was brought to the front and stood beside his court-appointed attorney. Celeste faced him, not with revenge, but with burning conviction. "Mr. Riker," she said, "this court sentences you to the highest penalties allowed under federal statutes. 6 years in prison for abuse of authority, 5 years for violating civil rights, and an additional year for obstruction of justice." She paused. "But that's just the legal portion." Riker didn't lift his eyes. "And here's the human part," she said, voice cool but cutting. "You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity and who wasn't. You believed your badge made you untouchable. That silence would protect you, that people like me would never hold the gavel." Her eyes stayed fixed on his. Well, now you get to sit in the seat you built for others.
No vaya. No robe.
Just the full weight of your actions. She gave a signal. Take him away. As Riker was led out, no one applauded. No one cheered. They simply watched, because this wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a moment to bear witness. And sometimes witnessing holds more power than clapping ever could. Celeste glanced down at the file again, the Monroe Mandate. She closed it, picked up her robe from the bench, and spoke one last time. Court is adjourned. The courtroom emptied slowly, like the passing of a heavy storm, one drop at a time. No one rushed. People lingered, spoke in hushed tones, embraced gently. A few paused to touch the wood of the banisters or brush their fingers over the courtroom doors, grounding themselves in a space that, until now, had felt like an impenetrable fortress. Back in her chambers, Celeste sat alone. The files were gone. The courtroom was quiet. Her robe still hung over the back of her chair like always. But now it felt different, lighter, not because the burden was lifted, but because it had finally been spoken aloud. She turned her chair toward the mirror behind her desk. Her reflection stared back. The patchy regrowth on her scalp had started to fill in. The silver curls that once adorned her crown were returning, slowly, unevenly. Part of her wanted to hide them, to conceal the scars, to smooth over the remaining raw edges. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her sister, Nain. She didn't say anything as she entered. She simply walked over, retrieved a folding stool from the corner, and set it behind Celeste. Then she took out a small pair of clippers and plugged them in. "You ready?" she asked. Celeste met her gaze in the mirror. No more fear, just resolve. "Yeah," she whispered. "Let's finish it." Nain worked slowly, gently. Each pass of the clippers was intentional, precise. The last uneven strands fell away. Not in shame this time, not in an act of violence, but by choice. Clean beginning. When she was done, Nain handed Celeste a mirror. Celeste turned it over in her hands before finally looking. The reflection that met her was bold.
Bore.
Strong. Beautiful. "You could wear that look every damn day and still own every room," Nain said with a smile. Celeste didn't respond right away. She just studied herself. "This is who I am now," she said softly. Nain corrected her gently.
No.
"This is who you've always been. Now the world just finally sees it." They both smiled. That evening, Celeste stepped out of the courthouse without a wig, without a scarf, without a hat. Just her head, high and bare, beneath the city lights. As she reached the sidewalk, a small cluster of bystanders saw her. There were no news crews this time, no flashing cameras, just people. One woman, maybe in her 70s, brown-skinned with thick glasses, stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Celeste's arm. "I never thought I'd live to see someone like you do what you just did," she said, voice trembling. Celeste held her hand. "You did more than survive," she said softly. "You paved the way." Behind her, a teenager stepped up, shy, unsure. No words, just a look. Then she took off her hoodie, revealing her own short, shaved hair, and nodded. Celeste nodded back. Something unspoken passed between them. Later that evening, Celeste stood on her front porch, gazing out over the peaceful neighborhood. Porch lights glowed softly, and a breeze rustled the oak branches. Inside, her phone buzzed with a flood of messages. Texts, emails, headlines, but she let them wait. Tonight wasn't about the noise. It was about finally hearing herself breathe. The next morning, she returned to the courthouse. On paper, it was just another routine day, but people noticed. Her robe stayed off a little longer than usual. The stares lingered too, but differently now. Not in confusion or dismissal, but in recognition. When she stepped into the judge's elevator, the janitor gave her a nod and tapped his fist gently against his chest. A silent gesture of pride. A young security guard offered a quick thumbs up, then turned away, blushing. And when she entered the courtroom for a basic civil hearing, the entire room stood, before the clerk even spoke her name. That had never happened before. She acknowledged them with a slight nod and took her seat. The law didn't pause. More hearings, more motions, more paperwork. But something at the core had changed. Not just the policies, the atmosphere. Justice had a different face now. One that didn't apologize for its presence. Celeste moved through the halls not with louder steps, but with greater presence. As if a woman who had been made small for years finally remembered how to take up space. Cameras still showed up. There were interviews she declined, headlines she avoided. But one, taped to the break room fridge, caught her attention a few days later. Federal judge won't back down after assault, launches groundbreaking reform. Someone had written in bold black marker underneath, "She's our judge." That made her smile. She hadn't set out to be a symbol. She only meant to do her job. But in standing her ground, something larger emerged, permission for others to stand too. Months passed. The courtroom, once filled with tension and silence, now held something else. Not perfection, not peace, but presence. A stillness that came from people knowing they'd be heard. The Monroe Mandate spread, first within her courthouse, then throughout the district. Other judges adopted it. Cities started asking about it. A bill was being drafted in Congress. Celeste hadn't planned that. But then again, much of what happened wasn't planned. She had simply refused to back down. And that alone had begun to shift the tide. She kept working civil cases, custody disputes, tax proceedings. But now, behind every ruling was a deeper awareness, not just of what the law said, but of who it had historically ignored. One afternoon, Celeste visited a middle school classroom. A teacher had invited her to talk about justice, about courage. She expected 10 students and a few awkward questions. Instead, the room was full. They had watched the trial, read the articles. Some had written essays. Others made posters. One was taped to the chalkboard. "Be like Judge Monroe." Her speech was brief. It didn't need to be long. The students asked the meaningful questions. How do you stay calm when people hate you? What did it feel like when they cut your hair? Did you ever want to give up? She answered them all with honesty. But one question lingered. A quiet voice from the back. "Do you still believe in the system?" Celeste paused, then replied, "I don't believe in what the system was, but I believe in what it can become. And I believe in people like you asking that question." That's how things begin to change. When she left the school, she cried in the car. For the first time in months. Not from pain, but from hope. Not long after, the White House reached out. Not for a soundbite, for something more. Celeste Monroe had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony would be televised, speeches written, dignitaries in attendance. But that wasn't what mattered to her. What mattered was who would sit in the front row. Nain, her clerk, Megan, her former intern, now a first-year law student, Reverend Hill, and in the far back corner, among rows of officials, sat the quiet girl from the classroom, the one who had asked the real question. The stage was grand, white marble steps rising toward the podium. The president stood nearby. When Celeste stepped forward, the applause swelled like a wave. But she didn't wave back, didn't raise her hands. She walked to the microphone and began. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she said. The room fell still. Not because I wasn't qualified, not because I didn't earn it, but because systems like this one were never designed with people like me in mind. She scanned the audience. And even when I finally stepped into the spaces I'd worked my entire life to reach, I was still made to feel like I didn't belong. She took a breath. But I stayed. I stood. And I made them see me. A pause. "I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I was lucky enough to survive a moment that should have broken me. And because I carry the memory of too many who didn't." Somewhere in the crowd, a camera clicked. "This medal doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to every woman told to stay silent. Every man made to believe justice wasn't his. Every child who looked at the law and saw only fear. This is for you." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was deep, respectful, as if people were clapping for something they finally understood. As the event ended, Celeste stepped off the stage. And far away, inside a prison across the state line, Hank Riker watched the broadcast on a wall-mounted TV. He didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared, as the woman he once tried to destroy stood honored by the very country he believed would never stand behind her. The screen went black, but the silence lingered. Not punishment, just truth. And truth, it turned out, was the one thing he had never been able to bury. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just one woman's story. It was a story about dignity, about truth, about what happens when we finally say, enough. Judge Celeste Monroe didn't just enforce the law. She became the line between right and wrong. She reminded us that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about responsibility, about rising after being torn down, about speaking up when silence feels safer, about leading with honor even when the system tries to crush you. For those of us who've lived long enough to witness both progress and resistance, this story resonates deeply. Because real change is slow, it's painful, and it requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe someone you love has. Maybe you've felt helpless. But this story shows that true power doesn't come from a badge, a title, or even a judge's bench. It comes from standing firm when the world wants you to fold. So, if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that change is still possible, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe so we can keep telling stories that matter, stories that challenge, uplift, and tell the truth out loud. Because justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It starts with us, right here, right now.